Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lecture on Identity and Access Management, or IAM for short, I'll talk about IAM policies that we use to provide fine-grained access for those users. Then I'll talk about user-based versus resource-based policies, because IAM user-based policies are not the only policies that are available. Some other services also have policies that can be applied to their services. And I'll talk about roles and how roles can be assumed by a user or resource to carry out actions on certain resources. Finally, I'll talk about identity federation, and that is how we use an external service or an external method to authenticate people outside of our Amazon account. An example of that is that we might use their Facebook account to authenticate them. So we grant access and manage permissions through the use of IAM policies. By default, users can't access anything in your account, so we need to grant permissions through the use of IAM policies. And they will define the effects, the actions, and the resources to which that policy applies. And they will also have conditions or optional conditions that can apply to that policy as well. Just a very simple policy there. So we've got a statement there that has the effect being allow. So we can have allow or deny. And the action is to have DynamoDB and all actions relating to DynamoDB, and the resource that it's going to apply to will be the table books there, the ARN for that. And on the subject of ARNs or Amazon Resource Names, all of our policies need to comply with the access policy language, and that requires us to specify the resource or resources using the Amazon Resource Name format. So what that looks like, it will be ARN, AWS, IAM, and then 2 colons. The reason there's 2 colons is because with an ARN, you would normally have a region in there, but because IAM is not region specific, it's a global service, that's empty. So you have 2 colons there. And then you have the account details and then the resource that it applies to. So here's some examples. We have an IAM user, and that will be ARN, AWS, IAM, and then 2 colons. And then the account number, and then the user details user/Bob. For a group, very similar, but it will be group/developers. For a role, it will be role/S3 access. And the same with an instant profile that can be associated with an EC2 instance. It will be instance profile, and then the name of that instance profile being web server. Now, federated users, they are a little bit different because they use the security token service as well as IAM. So although you do define a role in IAM to create a federated user, it is the security token service that makes that happen. So a federated user identified in IAM as Bob will be ARN, AWS, STS for the security token service, and then 2 colons again, and then the account number, and then federated user/Bob. Now, IAM policies or IAM user-based policies are not the only policies that you can use to restrict access. There are also resource-based policies that can be used within some of the AWS services. So IAM policies, they can contain resource level information about what resources this IAM policy will apply to, but they are attached to a user, a group, or a role. They're not attached to the resource, they are attached to the user, group, or role, and they specify the actions that are permitted and the resource that it applies to, for example, the EC2 instance or the RDS database. Separate from that, we have resource-based policies, and they are different to IAM policies, and they are attached to a resource, but they're only available for certain services. So for example, the Amazon S3 buckets can have a bucket policy attached to them within the S3 service. That is not an IAM policy, that's a bucket policy. But again, we can create an IAM policy for a user that can restrict access to a bucket as well. but we can apply a bucket policy to that bucket if we would like to. We can also have access control lists for a bucket or an object. Amazon Glacier has vault access policies that can be applied to an Amazon Glacier vault. We also have Amazon SNS topics, SQS and KMS can also have resource-based policies applied to them. Roles, they define permissions that can be assumed by users or resources. The difference between groups and roles, so a user can belong to multiple groups and they will inherit the permissions of all those groups. A role, you can only be assigned, a user can only be assigned to one role. So when you're assigned to that role, those are your permissions. You will have the permissions that belong to that role and nothing else. So that allows EC2 instances to access other AWS resources. It also allows you to grant access to your resources to users in another AWS account. It can also be used to allow users to temporarily assume a role and then give them least privilege access to critical resources. So what that means is that you might have some critical resources there that you want to really control access to that, even with your administrators. So you would create a role for access to those resources, and then your administrator will need to assume that role, and you would need to allow that to happen. And while that's happening, he or she can access those critical resources. But while he or she is doing that, they will only have the permissions that are associated with that role. So what they will need to do is that when they're finished using those critical resources, they will need to no longer assume that role and then go back and assume the permissions that belong to that group that they belong to. Identity federation is used a lot with IAM, especially developers. So an IAM role can be set up and used to specify permissions for externally identified or federated users. Now, we normally have a maximum of 5,000 IAM users per account. But if we use identity federation, it allows us to get over that limit of 5,000 users per account. So we have unlimited users. So identity federation enables unlimited temporary credentials to be created. They can be identified by your organization or a third-party identity provider, for example, Google or Facebook. So the methods that are available for federating users or for authenticating users, we can use the Amazon Cognito service. And they can use developer authenticated identity. So your application might be able to have a username and password set up for those users. We can have guest access set up, or we can use a public identity service provider such as Facebook or Google. We don't have to use Amazon Cognito. If we want to do it that way, we can actually just use the public service identity provider or OpenID Connect and use one of those OAuth services such as Facebook or Google or Amazon and use login with Facebook or whatever. And Facebook will authenticate that user for us and then we can grant temporary access for that user based upon that. We can also use an identity provider software package. For example, you might want to use Microsoft Active Directory, one that supports SAML2. And you can use that to authenticate your users, and then that will allow you to grant temporary access for those users. You can also create your own custom identity broker application or use a custom identity broker application that authenticates users. And they might authenticate users using the enterprise's LDAP or Microsoft Active Directory service and then use that custom identity broker application to access the AWS account. There is also the AWS Directory service for Microsoft Active Directory. And so you can use that as for your enterprise for managing your users. And you will have unlimited users because that will provide federated access on a temporary basis for that user. So that brings us to the end of the lecture. So there's some very important resources that you need to download. What I've done is I've created two documents. One of them is the key exam points, and they are things that I'm pretty convinced will be on the exam and that you need to know. If you don't know that, then you're going to be at risk of failing the exam. But additional to that, AWS expects you to read the AWS documentation, which is quite large, but I still recommend that you do read the AWS documentation. But if you don't have time to read it, I have distilled that into a document there. So there will be a document distilled or a document summary there of that documentation, and that will just be a few pages long. So if you read that, it will give you really the nuts and bolts in a nutshell about what's in the AWS documentation. And you can use that instead of reading the AWS documentation. But again, I thoroughly recommend you read the AWS documentation because that's going to be the best way to prepare for the course. So once you've either read the summary or read the documentation fully, you can complete the learning by quizzes that come at the end of this section. So that brings us to the end, and I'll see you in the next lecture.